This is our first PowerPoint in our series on psychological disorders. What is a psychological disorder? Most people would consider that abnormal behavior would be a part of a psychological disorder. Some type of abnormal thinking, behavior, that sort of thing. But to determine what is abnormal, we would have to try to define what is normal. So if you think for a minute, what would be your definition of normal? Are the things that you think are normal going to be considered normal to someone else, especially somebody maybe from a different culture? For example, eye contact. There's a big difference between how we use eye contact in different cultures. I know as a teacher, I was in like a fourth grade classroom, and this one of the little boys was just being um, not really listening, and I was trying to get his attention and try to talk to him about something. And I was actually being a substitute in that class on that day. And I'm looking at this little boy and I'm like, excuse me, you need to look at me when I'm talking to you. And the teacher's aide in the class was very, very helpful to me. She walked up to me and she says, "Can I talk to you for a second?" I said, "Sure." And I said, "Okay, you just wait here. I'll come back." So she took me aside and she said, actually, within that boy's culture, to look you in the eye when you're speaking to him would be considered very, very disrespectful. Now, at this point, I had not had a lot of cultural education. Since then, as a social worker and working with behavioral health, I've had tons and tons of training and experience with various cultures. That way, I've had the wonderful opportunity to learn about different cultures and learn that some things that are normal within one culture are not considered normal in a different culture. So, what is considered normal can be very subjective. Like maybe you're a person that likes to go out in your garden and you don't wear shoes. You're just, barefoot out there gardening, doing whatever. To one person, that might be considered very abnormal. Like, why would somebody do that? That's just weird. Your feet are going to get all dirty. Um, whereas another person just feels like, yeah, well, I live in the country. I don't mind all getting my feet dirty and touching the soil and whatever. And that's totally normal to this person. So the definition of normal is a very, very tricky thing. So we need to come up with some other way to determine what is abnormal behavior. In the field of psychology, those who study psychopathology, which is the study of psychological disorders, including their symptoms, etiology, and treatment, people who are in this field help us to try to characterize what abnormal behavior may look like and when a psychological disorder may be present. A psychological disorder is a condition characterized by abnormal thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So you may or may not have all three of these things going on with abnormal thinking, feelings, and behaviors. And we'll go into a lot of details about those factors when we look at each different group of mental health disorders that we're going to look at. And behaviors, thoughts, and inner experiences that are atypical, dysfunctional, or distressing. So behaviors are just things that a person is doing. Thoughts are kind of the way their thinking works, different patterns of thinking, and inner experiences could be hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there, feeling things, um, a complete feeling of being on edge all the time. Those types of things are inner experiences. And so things like that that are considered atypical or deviant, meaning deviant from the norm, dysfunctional, meaning that that person is not functioning at an appropriate level um, for where they are in life, or distressing, meaning that it is objectively distressing. We're going to go into detail on those factors on the next slide. In addition to these three factors, the deviance, the dysfunctional, and distressing components, You can also include dangerous behaviors, thoughts, and inner experiences. Now, danger is not part of the diagnostic criteria within the diagnostic manual that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Your book may or may not, depending on which book you're using, include dangerousness as part of the criteria. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Or actually, I'm just going to go ahead and hit on it right now. The dangerous behaviors, most of the time, are dangerous to the person with the mental health disorder. Now, people with mental illness are often not dangerous. The majority of people with a psychological disorder are not dangerous. However, a lot of people with psychological disorders are actually victims of crime. So, for example, if you have somebody that acts weird and they're talking to themselves, and their thoughts are clearly confused, maybe they have persecutorial hallucinations or ideations where they feel like they're being persecuted and things like that. Oftentimes they're a victim of a crime. And I've seen this a lot with the police station, because what happens is these people will come in because their phone is stolen or they've been assaulted or something like that. And it's really happened, but because of their mental disorder, they are not taken seriously. So I've had to do a lot of training within the San Bernardino Police Department to teach people how to recognize that actually a crime may have happened. Like, we had a bunch of people coming in that were, obviously had mental disorders, paranoia, hallucinating, delusional thinking, all of these different things. Yet it turned out that there was somebody going around knocking these people down and taking their phones. So, they really are trying to report a crime. And so oftentimes they're easy victims and easy targets, because who's going to believe them anyway? Just want to throw that out there. There are certain situations where a person with a mental disorder can be dangerous. And that often is when they are having such severe delusional thinking, where they feel like somebody is an enemy and they have to act on it in order to save their own life, save their family's life, and then they can maybe harm somebody. We had one guy that was assessed, and unfortunately it was a different team. Luckily it wasn't me, but another team had assessed him and said, yeah, he's got delusional thinking. He's got these thoughts of harming people. However, he does not seem to be in a position to actually do any harm to anybody. Well, the next day he went out and killed a homeless guy who he was convinced was causing him all these problems. Just some rando guy that he ended up killing. So obviously the behavioral health team, the emergency team, missed it. And that's something that can happen, but we do the best that we can. So once again, most of the time, people with mental disorders are not dangerous. It's only like when somebody has a command hallucination that's telling them to do something, or really extremely delusional thinking, when people tend to be dangerous. And that's a very small minority of people with mental health issues. There is no single definition of psychological abnormality or normality. These things are very subjective, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. Just because something is atypical means that it is kind of outside of the norm. It does not mean it's disordered. Red hair is considered unusual because the population of people with red hair is very small, but it is still not abnormal. Just because they have red hair does not make them abnormal. Okay, moving on to the next slide. How do we characterize abnormal behavior? I like to use the 3Ds. So the 3Ds would be deviance, dysfunction, and distress. And then you can throw danger on there at the end there. So deviance, we're talking about deviance from the norm. So basically behaviors that are not considered to be normal or typical behaviors from a cultural standpoint. Now, deviance in itself is not something that we would consider to be criteria for a mental disorder just based on itself. For example, Martin Luther King very deviant. He deviated quite a bit from the norm. The norm of the day was that black people couldn't have the same rights as white people. And he deviated greatly from the norm, cost him his life, but he, opened the door through his deviant behavior to get rights for black people, women, and other minorities. So all deviance is not bad. Sometimes, protests are a deviant type of behavior, but that doesn't mean it is particularly an abnormal behavior. So the type of deviance that we like to characterize as abnormal would be something in the range of um, something that would be very outside of the norm from the cultural perspective, really. Um, and then dysfunction, we're talking about usually something that is harmful to the person. So dysfunction would be like an impaired type of functioning. For example, let's say that this person had been working and had a really good job, had been going to work every day on time, everything's great. And now, for some reason, he is deviating from that normal behavior. In other words, he's starting to miss work. He's starting to be late from work. This is some type of dysfunction also. He is now not functioning at the level he was functioning at before. And then the distress factor is a very subjective experience. Usually, distress is the person with the mental disorder is experiencing distress. The dog is barking, so it's driving me nuts. So, for example, let's say that somebody is really starting to feel very depressed and very, it's making it hard to get up, hard to get a shower, hard to get to work on time. Well, this type of distress, this type of change in behavior, and this type of dysfunction is leading that person to feel distressed, their own personal subjective feeling of distress. And usually that factor of distress is what gets somebody to go seek help and see a therapist. You're feeling really anxious, and this anxiousness makes you like not able to drive to work, causing you dysfunction, deviating from the norm. Most people are okay and can go drive to work. And this is causing you distress, personal distress. So at that point, usually somebody goes and seeks therapy. Now, there are certain disorders where the distress happens to the person adjacent to the one with the mental disorder. For example, if you have depression, anxiety, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, these types of disorders, if you are experiencing one of those disorders, you will be the one feeling distress. However, in a lot of personality disorders, specifically in antisocial personality disorder, somebody in that particular disorder is causing a lot of distress to the people around them, where that individual is not experiencing distress, but the people around this person are experiencing distress. And we'll talk about that more when we get to personality disorders. Danger, once again, not a criteria listed in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual that we're going to talk about shortly, or in a different video, actually. And the danger oftentimes is to the person with the mental disorder. For example, there are certain personality disorders that have super high suicide rates. Depression, somebody who's depressed is not always suicidal. There is, a percentage of people who are depressed that are suicidal. However, some of these personality disorders have even higher rates of suicide. And that is a danger to themselves. For example, bipolar disorder and oh my gosh, I can't think of it. Borderline personality disorder. Those two personality disorders have very high suicide rates. And so these folks with that type of mental disorder are a danger to themselves. much more than to someone else. Once again, I wanted to touch on culture. Cultural expectations play a large role in what we feel is normal versus abnormal. So, something, to consider something as being abnormal, you would need to violate cultural expectations. However, that is not enough by itself to identify a psychological disorder. Social norms may vary between cultures. What is considered appropriate in one culture may be viewed differently in another. For example, hallucinations in Western societies, basically, that is not a normal thing within Western societies. People who report hallucinations are likely to be labeled with a psychological disorder of some sort. And there are many different disorders that include hallucinations. A hallucination is a type of sensory response that is not triggered by your sensory receptors. For example, I'm hearing voices, but there's no actual person talking to stimulate my sensory neurons in my ear, my receptor cells. Or maybe I feel like there's bugs crawling all over me. However, there are no bugs on my skin triggering the sensory receptors in my skin. So, that would be a violation of our cultural expectation in Western societies. However, in some other cultures, certain types of hallucinations are highly valued. So within other cultures, sometimes people with hallucinations or hearing voices, it's thought that they are really more in touch with the spirit world. So it just depends on the culture itself, how these things are viewed. So culture really matters when we're looking at something to determine whether it is kind of a normal or abnormal behavior. Just another quick look of characteristics of psychological disorders. So deviation from the norm is one of our criteria. Remember, that's something, behavior that is outside of what we would consider a normal behavior. The criterion of maladaptiveness or dysfunction, behavior that disrupts social, academic, or vocational life. So it's something that is impacting that person's functioning. They are no longer functioning at the same level that they were before, and it's causing some sort of problem in their life. And then the criterion of personal distress. So that's subjective feelings of anxiety, depression, or other unpleasant emotions. And once again, the usually that personal distress is what sends somebody to the therapist, because they're distressed that they are no longer functioning at the right level. They know that what they're doing is not considered normal. And usually in most mental health or mental disorders, the person is aware that their functioning is not necessarily normal. So they end up going to a therapist, finding out what's going on with them, and moving forward with some type of treatment. There are actually a lot of barriers, though, to people reaching out for help. And different cultures have different viewpoints on whether or not mental illness even exists or a mental disorder even exists. Now, in certain cultures or certain religious settings, it's thought that, maybe mental disorders don't exist. So there's a lot of biases and stigmas out there related to mental disorders. Oftentimes, people are worried about how they're going to be viewed if they address the possibility that they may have a mental disorder and actually go get therapy. How are they going to be viewed? Now, I notice with older people like me, my generation, that, and I'm a grandma, I'm getting up there in my 60s. So, my generation was not as open to therapy or talking about things like that. Whereas, like Gen Z, everybody's in therapy. In my classes with my younger people now, you'll talk about something and somebody will raise their hand and say, yeah, I'm taking this and that because I have anxiety. And, this other person's like, yeah, I was, I have major depressive disorder, and they talk about it in class. It's really interesting. It's very different compared to like when I was their age. Now, when we take a look at the biases and stigmas and how people are viewed with mental health, with mental disorders, um, versus somebody with a health disorder. So if we look at the let me see if I can get a pointer here. Boop. If we look at this side and we look at health disorder, let's say that somebody is battling cancer. So they have cancer and they go into remission and they're not in remission and they're remission and not in remission. And so they're going through all of this. People would describe this person who's dealing with this health problem, like cancer or something, as a fighter or a survivor or tough or strong or courageous or blessed. Now, these are actual terms from a class. This is an activity that I usually do in my face-to-face classes where we put this up on the board, and I start usually by saying, okay, if somebody is fighting cancer or, dealing with diabetes and dealing with all these different disorders, how would you describe this person? And then they give me all of these things: fighter, survivor, tough, strong, courageous. And on the other side, I say, okay, how do you describe people dealing with a psychological disorder? And so they gave me things like crazy or the R word or insane or stupid or psycho or dumbass. So being characterized like this is one of the reasons that people do not seek therapy. And it has to do with the biases and stigmas associated with it. And if you take abnormal psych, we talk quite a bit about the biases and stigmas related to mental health disorders and the stereotypes and things like that. Let's see. I think that's it for this particular slide. Yeah, I think this is it for this particular video. So we're going to go ahead and end it here. And then I think we're going to go into our different perspectives on mental disorders in our next video. And hopefully my dogs will stop barking by then. It's the middle of the night, but they think there's things out there. All right, you guys, have a good evening. Apparently, I'm a liar who lies. I have one more slide for you. And this slide has to do with being insane, or the concept of insanity. Insanity is a legal term, not a psychological diagnosis or a psychological term. It is strictly a legal term, and it is one that is used when somebody wants to put forth an insanity plea in a court case, in an effort to try to be declared not guilty due to insanity or some type of ruling like that. Different states have different criteria that they use. California used what's called the McNaughton rule, which basically is where the lawyer tries to prove that the client did not know what he was doing at the time and he did not know it was wrong. And then there are some other criteria that they have to meet as well, but we're not going to get into that. Other states use what's called the American Law Institute, which is a cognitive rule and a volition rule. The cognitive rule is saying that they did not know what they were doing was wrong, or they didn't know what they were doing at the same time. And then they were not in voluntary control of the behavior. Like, they were just, maybe they were on drugs or something and stabbed somebody to death, but they didn't actually know that they were doing that. And so they weren't in control of their behavior, they didn't know what they were doing, and they didn't know that it was wrong at the time. So that would kind of be a defense there. So I just thought this was an interesting point to add. Your book may or may not be going over this, depending on which book you're using. Okay, so that's it really until our next presentation.